Welcome to another episode of Kamalayan Journeys to Self-Awareness. I'm your host, Stephanie, and I have my co-host here, Leo.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again. It's been a while.
It's been a while. It's been several months.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's good to be back. It's good to be back and record some material tapos and try to get started and talk about some things. And so Leia, I know this is a topic that you suggested, and do you want to share
Mhm.
a bit about this?
Sure. On today's episode, we'll be discussing something that's common,
Mm-hmm.
commonly done by all of us. Yeah, I don't think
Mm-hmm.
it's escapable at all. So uh, today we'll be talking about conversations and the importance and the impact of talking and listening effectively. So before we get right into it, I just like to draw some parameters so that at least we're all clear where we're going with this discussion. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's first important to establish what we actually mean by conversations. So it's more than small talk. We're referring to
Mm,
conversations here more than the casual chats, like when you bump into someone at the grocery store. So, what we mean by conversations are discussions that entail a considerable amount of time with whomever you're with.
mm,
So, topics, of course, aren't necessarily deep or serious matters. I mean, it can be light, cursory, and superficial.
mm,
Um, but other than whatever is discussed, I feel like it's important to address that conversations entail the sharing of time, the sharing of each other's attention,
mm.
and it also entails an exchange of ideas and a thrashing out of thoughts. So, as mentioned earlier, as humans, it's in our nature and experience to participate in conversations. So, it's only natural that we talk about this, for this is
Yeah,
the very essence of our podcast, after all, right? And that's the reason why we put
that's
this
true.
together, um, and how important talk is. And in our 15th, rather on our 15th episode, I think it's only fitting that we talk about what the essence of this whole project is, right? Talk.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, the second thing that I'd like to uh, put on the table is why are conversations important, right?
Hmm.
Um, how about you, Steph? Like, how do you feel conversations matter? Why do they matter?
It's especially yung mga conversation, because when we talked about like conversations, I for me yung idea ko is really the ability to deepen whatever it is that they have going on. So if, for example, you're talking to a friend, you're having conversations with a friend, it allows it to go deeper kung you have, effective listening going on, you have validation, you have all of those things, because then yung conversations nyo or yung relationship nyo goes down to parang na-elevate siya, right? Na-elevate siya simply because
Mm,
of that. And for example,
mm,
like if you're talking to like a parent or like a tita, whatever it is, right? So
mm,
yun yung value ng conversations and yung effective na listening, because it really elevates it. And I just don't mean elevate as in like naging sophisticated, but obviously it deepens it. I mean, that's the
mhm,
word I was looking for. It deepens it.
mhm,
And
mm,
then when there's that depth, then there's a little bit more meaning. There's a little
mm,
bit more joy, right? So ganon. So
yeah.
it just, that's pretty much yun yung that's what comes to my mind.
Mm. You mentioned about validation, and it reminds me of, do you remember that recurring philosophical idea during college that um, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? I would always hear that, but I wouldn't really pay attention to it. But it's only now
Mm,
that thinking about this topic, it made me realize how important conversations are, because in the act of the other person presenting themselves,
mm,
they are actually witnessed, they are acknowledged and
mm-hmm,
heard,
mm-hmm,
right? So I feel
mm-hmm.
like that whole philosophical adage that we'd always hear during college is all about validation. It validates existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the reason why a lot of humans actually participate in it, because we want to be seen, we
Yeah,
want
we
to be
want to be
heard,
heard.
and we want to know that we actually exist, that we
Exist.
matter, right? So I feel
Yeah.
like that's one of the important aspects, details of conversations. So I mean, if you're a tree, obviously, and you fall, and somebody hears you fall, then you know that you actually fell,
Yeah,
to put it simply,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just that word, no, that it validates one's existence. That's so
Hmm.
powerful. Parang we sit with that. Like that's
Hmm.
so powerful because I mean, I can talk more about like even just kind of, sa clients ko, like just the fact that when they share something and they often tell me na I've never shared this with anyone, like kung ano man lang
Hmm.
they went through because every time I would, parang open my mouth, I would be called like either you're being OA, you're being over dramatic, you're like too much,
Hmm.
ganyan, ganyan. So they've learned to like not say it. And so when they do share it and I reflect that and I validate that, it's
Yeah.
almost like, oh my gosh, like I feel seen and heard. I feel like yung little child in me has been heard. So it's so,
Hmm.
so, it's so powerful. Sobra.
It definitely is. I mean, the power lies aside from validation. I feel like the power also lies in the act of the ability to express, the
Mm,
freedom to do so. Like if there is that safe space created, which we'll talk about more later when we're addressing the whole topic on effective listening. And if a great conversation is basically a safe space where you can freely express yourself,
mhm,
right? And the power there is, aside from the validation, is also the ability to be generous with oneself, that
mm,
you can
mm,
share, that you can
mm,
share. And I feel like there's a lot of power in that, the power of also being vulnerable and not being judged, the power of you on the receiving end taking it all in.
mhm,
And I
mhm,
think it also entails some form of gratitude, right? Like, thank you for telling me all of these things. You didn't have
mhm,
to, but you did.
mhm,
And that's
mhm,
powerful, right? That's
mhm.
affecting and it's quite moving. Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite cathartic, actually. That's the word that I was also looking for. Yeah. Because you're trying
Yeah.
to purge a lot of times, right? When you're talking. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, and not only that, I find also, aside from expression, it the whole idea of catharsis is the ability, rather the need to find perspective, and that's what I feel a lot
Mm,
of times why we participate in conversations, because we need a mirror. We need to.
yeah.
It's kind of like journal writing, right? You
Yeah.
need to put your thoughts
Mm-hmm.
down, and in this case, you need to hear it,
Talk.
and you need
Yeah.
to hear
Here.
it and echoed back, right?
Mm,
So there is that aspect to it. Well, we've mentioned about talking, and we also mentioned about listening. And I guess it's a great time to move to what we mean by effective listening. What are your thoughts on this, Steph? Like, what makes it efficient, and what makes
yeah.
listening work?
If when you think about like effective listening, what really helps, at least sa akin, na like my experience again, kind of like what I said earlier now, when people come to me,
Mm,
they're really looking for that, person that can listen to them, listen to their story. And so, because again, a lot of times they've been burned before, meron na silang experiences before na negative. And so they just, want to be able to, come in and have that person, listen. So in terms of like effective listening, what I kind of mentioned earlier, yung purpose of it or what makes it very effective is that it deepens the relationship. There's
yeah,
a sense
yeah.
of being, heard when one opens up and one truly takes the time to listen and understand.
Hmm.
Yun nga, that's the essence of what happens is like the other person feels, closer to that other person and it deepens the relationship. Now, kind of like what I said,
Yeah, yeah.
earlier. And sa akin din, in terms of, effective listening, I mean, if we put that into practice, if a lot of us put more of that into practice, I feel like it really changes parang the trajectory of like, I mean, there's going to be less conflicts in the world. Yun lang yung sa akin, right?
Mm,
If we put that into
yeah,
practice, kasi there's less, if you truly listen to what the other person was saying, we're less likely to jump to conclusions. We're less likely to make assumptions about the person, right?
right,
Kasi
right.
if, for example, like we're having a conversation, tapos sinabi mo lang na parang, oh, like ang mahal, I waited for so long, tagal nang inintay ko dun sa blah, blah, blah. And if I just kind of assume, or if I jump to conclusions that I'm to si Leo, sobrang impatient naman, blah, blah, blah. If I didn't really try to hear you out initially, at least give you that more of a space to talk more about your experience, I would make that assumption. I would make that conclusion about you. Tapos, wala na. I'm distracted already. But if I open that up a little bit more and really truly listen, I would see na the reason why you were so exasperated is because, kailangan mo, you need to get to somewhere because, you're waiting for, you need to get to somewhere because it benefited yung partner mo or like friends mo or whatever it is, right? We open that up and we truly know na there's a lot more to what we see on the surface. No, so that's for me, yun yung value. And that's why, honestly, people come to therapy. A lot of people come to therapy because they're really looking for that. And that's why there's so much value in this skill because people need to be heard.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think you mentioned about trauma several times and how it disrupts this safe space, right? That's one of the reasons why people go to therapy and they choose to speak to a therapist because they have nobody safe to speak with, either at home or among their friends, right? I don't want to generalize, but it seems like that's the case. Where do you suppose this comes from? I mean, in my experience, I feel like it usually comes from, for the person administering the trigger or administering the trauma, rather, I feel like it comes from this righteousness, this entitlement to just be right. And sometimes they don't know about it. And the reason why they stop the other person from sharing or they disregard the other person's feelings when they're sharing is because they just want to be right about one thing. Like, for example, you mentioned about assumptions. So if you assume that, ano ba to si Leo, ang arte-arte naman, pinaantay ko lang ng couple of minutes, biglang sumabog na siya and all that. Even by you standing by your thought or your impression of my experience is parang you're insisting on being right. And it goes back to what you said about a lot of conflict. I feel like it boils down to people insisting on being right. That's why they don't hear or they don't really listen to the other person.
I think for me personally, I don't necessarily see it as like people coming from like a place of righteousness or like, tama sila.
Yeah.
For me, like ito yung mga themes na commonly nakikita ko, no? Like for example, like why yung mga tao really find it hard to listen or effectively reflect kung ano yung sinabi. Kasi for me, I'm gonna start with parang yung pinaka-basic form, which is like a lot of times, we're just distracted, right? There's so many things that's going on. Like, some people are just not in the present. They're actually thinking of their own, like yung mga own tasks that need to be done. Dun yung preoccupied sila about that, right? And so it's hard. So when you have somebody that's in front of you and like sharing yung mga thoughts nila, wala, they're just not there, right? Yung another point naman na I can see and I could see sa practice ko and just everyday life about why people find it hard to listen is especially, there's this tinatawag na parang trauma response about needing to kind of like either assert themselves or defend themselves, right away. Kasi parang a lot of times it feels like either they need to defend themselves, they need to make a conclusion or quick conclusion about something so that they can quickly assess something. Right? So in your case, for example, yung sinabi ko na, si Leo, ang ate-ate naman ito. I don't know, but maybe I've had to like, that's been like years of like my response that I've had to make a quick assessment of you and the situation in order to survive. Right? Whatever it is. Maybe that was like a helpful coping mechanism before the past, but right now it's not helpful because obviously I'm losing yung relationship natin. Right? I'm making this big assumption about you and I'm not allowing you to deepen, yung sinabi mo. And so, yung one thing din makikita ko is that another trauma response, it's again, I said the word defend. Kasi sometimes then when one person is earnestly trying to share something to the other person, and yung other person is deflecting or ganyan. It's a lot of times it's, they feel like if they need to defend something because they feel like either it's like yung character nila is being assassinated or is being attacked, right? They feel like they're being attacked. And so obviously yung ego nila is gonna get stirred up. And when that gets in the way, then it's hard to like really listen, no? Kasi that takes up a lot of space. I mean, ano yung thoughts mo about that, Lay?
If I were to base it on my personal experience, somebody very dear to me, whom I love, but whom I have trouble really having meaningful and two-way conversations with. I really had to exert that effort, that conscious effort, one, not to react not to react, and two, to expect that I would be triggered by some of the things that she would be saying or doing while I was talking. What I eventually found out when I was patient with her and with myself was I understood more where she was coming from, and the reason why, like you said, she was quick to give her opinion, to judge on the matter, or to judge on an experience, or my experience for that matter, was because she was coming from a place where she didn't want to be misunderstood. She was coming from a place that, a place of defense, basically, because I guess she was already burned in the past, perhaps by me, even with some of the things I've told her. And maybe she made a story about it. She planted the seed, or as you put it, it festered.
Yeah.
Kind of like the example you gave earlier about you and me. So it's become a wall. It's become a filter. So in whatever future conversations I had with her, that was always present. That, I have to really explain myself or else he won't believe me. Or, I have to talk louder than he would because he might run over me and take over the conversation, and I would feel less than myself. So these were a lot of things that came into play. And I must say that I was successful in some way, because after giving myself the space and her the space, conversations were, in as much as it would still, be triggersome, if that's a word, but it was less filled with conflict. Like there was more understanding. There was more listening instead of hearing, so I understood where she was coming from. So that one for me was an accomplishment. It was a success, because I was able to give her leeway. I was able to allow her, allow her presence, allow her in the space, instead of like, because I mean, truthfully, you mentioned about, biases and filters. It goes both ways, eh? And I'm pretty sure, like when she's talking to me, I also have a bias against her and a filter, so I'm guilty of that too. So I really had to let that go. So that one takes a lot of effort, and if you're in just everyday conversations, with friends and all that, it's just, I wonder if it's something that people really think about.
Right.
Or is it necessary? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a lot of effort.
It's a lot of effort. I mean, it's a lot. Obviously, we're not expecting our listeners or anybody or people to be therapists. It's ano siya, like obviously, like it takes years and all of that. Pero I think like within your case, I just wanna mention briefly, Lay, before I jump to my next point. Yung sinabi mo na parang with this person that's in your life, when you gave that person that space, tapos you gave yourself that space, parang you just carved out something. Tapos once kinarve out mo yan, there was a little bit more room for understanding, a little bit more room for compassion, not just for this person, but for yourself also. So you can see na when you made space for that, hindi ka ganong escalated. It sounds like
actually,
it, no? Hindi ganong escalated, right? And so when regulated ka, that's what we say in therapy. When you're regulated and you're not as escalated, yung response mo, yung parang heightened sense mo is not getting in the way of really truly having a bit more understanding about the matter.
Mm,
No, which is yan yung
yeah.
and and that's what's helpful, right? Because we're not looking for an understanding right away. We're just looking for nuggets each and every single time we talk
Yeah,
to this person, 'di ba? Hindi naman siya yung
exactly.
change, right away. The other point I was gonna say na yun nga,
Yeah.
because again, obviously, like I'm working from like a trauma focused, and tapos yung I'm a trauma focused therapist. So yung other, aside from yung fight response, which is the need to defend, which is the need to parang assert,
Yeah.
make a quick assessment. The other one is like yung parang freeze response, and I think really common yung freeze response, which is like yung, let's say somebody shared something big, like a confession or something, right?
Yeah.
And our freeze response is like to just parang not know what to say, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're flooded in their bodies. No, they dissociate.
Yeah.
I know, sino ba yun? I just heard from another therapist share na there was something big that happened with a client of hers, and when that wife shared sa husband, the husband couldn't say anything. Tapos it left the wife hurt kasi parang the husband didn't say anything. But if you think of the matter, the fact of the matter is na-flood siya. Like yung na-overwhelm yung body, trauma response niya, yung body, yung daming cortisol levels that just kind of got pumped in his body. Tapos talagang he doesn't know what to
Oh
do,
my.
right? So he's froze in
Yeah.
the moment. So then walang response, right? And I think it happens more often than we think, the sense of flooding,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
a lot of people, when they get inundated with information, it's like, oh my gosh, it's just too much. And so sometimes, a lot of times, these people, the ones who get easily flooded, sometimes they struggle. A lot of them struggle with asserting themselves and saying, wait lang, that's a lot. Wait lang, can we just like break it down a little
Yeah.
bit, right? Or
Yeah.
ito muna, and then let's talk about this. These are the people that I find that it's hard for them to assert that. So because it's hard for them to assert it, the more sila
Yeah.
naka-flood. And the more the other
Yeah.
person is like, la, 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 ganun, right?
Yeah.
So and then when they get flooded, nag-shut down na sila, and they can't really, they don't have the ability to process or listen effectively, no?
Yeah.
Kasi yun na yung
Yeah.
response in them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, ano yung thoughts mo?
I find it really interesting that you've put like, I don't know how to official terminology. I mean, you have terms for it, because I can only describe, and a lot of times I'm sure our listeners can relate to what you said, how they react in conversations. It's that they either become defensive, right, or they fight, or they flee, right? They freeze.
More like freeze, yeah.
And I think it's important. Yeah, I think it's important that people know about these things, or at least have an awareness of it. They don't have to memorize terms, but the reason being is because you see yourself, right, in the conversation. You see yourself reacting. You see how the other person perhaps reacts. And you use, for example, the words that they say, the replies, the body language, it becomes, it's engaging in the true sense of the word. It's not just interesting, but it becomes engaging because you're being part of the conversation. You're truly being in it because you're actually understanding the other person, understanding yourself, and we mentioned earlier about, just to piggyback on what you said with these responses, about the idea that effective listening also entails being present. And I feel like being aware of the other person, their reactions, their body language, being aware of yourself is also a manifestation of being present. Wouldn't you say? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Because here in my notes, one of the things that I just thought about the idea of being present is an example I would give. I get this a lot. I mean, no offense to my friends, but I get this a lot from my friends, like when I'm having a conversation with them. um, it kind of ticks me off when I see them scrolling on their phones.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
While
mean,
you're
I always say
talking.
that, oh, yeah, yeah. And I
Mm,
feel like I
yeah.
know that some people have the gift of multitasking, but really, if you're scrolling on, TikTok or Reels or whatnot or Facebook
Yeah.
stories, you're not really present. You're just
Yeah.
hearing, but you're not listening. So
Yeah.
aside from this awareness of the other, awareness of yourself, your reactions, I feel like you being there, physically present, and looking at the person in the eye. Well, you don't have to really look them in the eye. I mean, that would
Right.
be weird, but you know, uh, participating,
Yeah.
and not looking at your phone. In a way, I kind of appreciated that, you have these scenes in movies, like when they're out with their friends, they put their phones on the table
Yeah. Kung pwede lang like may
because they're not
basket at like
allowed.
the entrance
Uh,
and you just dump it there,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, that's a good idea,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also a reflection of, it's a sign of the times, that we're really
That's
the
true.
phone, social media. I mean,
Yeah.
we can't fight it. It's just the way things are. But we can only hope that if people would like to be invested in relationships, like you
Yes,
said, like
yun.
to make it deeper,
Exactly.
um, that an amount of effort to be present, to take
Yes.
out the phone, to be aware of the others, would do
Yeah.
wonders, right, for any relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's another topic kasi ako I'm passionate like you or like it really ticks me off, honestly. Like I don't really truly believe in multitasking. So when I see people like na ganyan, talagang it really ticks me off. So parang for me lang, okay, okay, well, let's see. Pero again, like what I said, with different podcast yan the next
True.
episode because I don't
Yeah.
know, but yeah. Um, I think yung last, you
Hmm.
know, yung last na sabihin ko about why people like find it hard to like really listen,
Uh-huh.
is that yung I think a lot of times to again yung trauma responses, right? We talked about freeze, we talked about fight, we talked about freeze, and next one is flee, which is super common then,
Uh-huh.
right? About like,
Okay.
shutting down or avoiding the topic, right? Avoiding the
Oh, okay.
topic.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
when there's like a parang a topic that's being, discussed, um, parang I don't want to listen or ayoko to, like blah blah blah. Um, because a lot of times, kind of similarly to like freeze, it is overwhelming. So I want to avoid this. This is too much for
Mm,
me. Yung
yeah.
body ko is telling me to get the hell out of this conversation kasi hindi ko, this is eliciting such a big response. And so in
Yeah.
order to avoid this feeling that I have, in order to
Yeah.
avoid any further conflict that may happen, I'm just going to avoid
Yeah.
this and shut down and move myself to a different room. It's not so much about obviously the person that was sharing the thing, but more on yung person that was listening. Like, this is too much for me. Di ko to kaya. So
Yeah.
I'm just gonna move, right? And so
Yeah. Yeah.
and shift away. So those are just
Mm,
my thoughts. I mean,
yeah.
ikaw, Lennon. I don't remember like
Yeah.
anything of that experience, but I don't know if you have like thoughts or any personal experiences about that. Then fleeing,
I've Since we've
avoiding.
started this podcast and uh, during the pandemic, being aware about mental health issues, etc., and reading up about it, on social media, as well as doing my own research on it, um, I've learned that there is a way of fleeing without necessarily having to just drop everything and just,
Yeah.
because I think I've experienced that in some conversations where the person just suddenly leaves,
Mm-hmm.
and that obviously is the truest example of the
Form
flee
of like,
response, right?
yeah, yeah,
But what I've become more aware of is that when I do have triggers, when certain topics or certain ways of talking
yeah.
becomes a little bit too much for me, that it's okay and it's actually possible to verbalize it to the other person. You can
Mm-hmm.
tell them that I'm not
Mm-hmm.
ready to talk about this,
Yeah.
or you can even call attention to the moment and say that, you know what, I think we're no longer being effective. I mean, not in those words, obviously, but we're no longer hearing each other out.
Yeah.
So maybe we can give ourselves time first, or I'm not going to engage for now.
And then
So
come back to this
because
kasi
I'm,
yun yung pinaka-importante,
yeah,
right? and come back to
Yeah.
this, because a lot of times we just stay and like, let's not talk about it. Let's avoid lang, avoid. And it becomes bigger
Yeah.
and bigger and bigger, right? But the
Yeah.
key is like, babalik kayo
Yeah.
dun sa table, right?
That one actually is another podcast altogether, because I feel like the Filipino culture is steeped in sweeping things under the rug, you know?
Yeah.
So it's quite an
Yeah.
avoidant culture. But yeah, well, the other thing that I want to mention, I mean, I'm grateful that you put towards these responses.
Mm.
Um, the other things also that I'd like to put on the table, like when you're listening, is we mentioned this earlier, the idea that your prejudices and your biases come into play. I mean, we have to accept the fact that a lot of what and who we are is a product of biases, of things that we've gathered along the way, experiences, and uh, the things that we've put together, that we've thought, that we've manufactured, that this is how we view life, our point of view. I think it's important also to be aware of that when you're in a conversation. There was one phrase that I remember encountering in the past in one of the talks that I attended, and it was called, in air quotes, always already listening. And what they meant by that, or at least what I understood, was you come you come into a conversation already with your biases, i.e., a filter. So therefore, you're not necessarily being present or even listening to the other person, because whatever they say, you've already filtered it so that you can be right and be right about the formula you've put together and the idea you have of that person. So I think people should be aware of that their biases come into play, because a lot of times when people respond, when they're talking to you, one of the things that kind of ticks me off is the whole unsolicited advice thing.
Yeah.
When you're sharing something and then they just give you advice. A lot of times you're like, okay, I know it's coming from a place of love and maybe concern, but a lot of times it's just like, that's not really what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And parang people don't realize also that the advice you're giving is from your experience, and what makes you think that it can fit my experience, And I know, again, that it's coming from a place of concern and love and that they just want to help. But I hope people who are listening also realize that sometimes you don't have to say anything, right? Your mere presence is enough.
Yeah.
Your ear is enough, right? You don't have to give them fabulous, words of wisdom and what you should do and all that, unless of course it's asked for.
Yeah.
That's one of
Kasi yung presence mo is enough.
pet peeves too. Yeah, exactly. So it also it adds on to the safe space, right? So I'm sure you have, like, you've heard of your friends say that, oh, ang galing naman ni ganito, ganyan, kasi every time we talk, as in talagang feeling ko nakikinig siya and all that, because they listen without judgment. They listen without prejudice. They're not quick to give advice.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people also, they hate advice, they don't want to hear your advice. They want to figure it out on their own.
Yeah. And they're just looking for they're just looking for, sorry, Lay. They're just really looking to share that lang. That's all that they want to do. They don't need any advice. They don't need somebody to hover over them and make recommendations, because that's not what they're looking for.
Yeah, exactly, right? So so people should be aware that they come to the table with biases, and if they're aware of that, then maybe they can lessen it, not necessarily put it on the table, so that they can just be fully present. So it goes back to that again about being fully present. The other thing also, before I forget, that I wanted to mention about effective listening is the idea of empathy. So we've talked about, just to put things into a term, we talked about earlier about being there for the other person, understanding where they're coming from, giving them the generosity, rather being generous enough to give them that space, right? I think that, in so many words, actually defines empathy, because you're trying to understand the other person, putting yourself in their point of view, in their perspective, and you're putting yourself in that position so you could understand them more. So in your understanding of them, it actually lessens you putting yourself in the conversation because you're just really being there for them.
Yeah,
Because you
exactly.
get where they're coming
Exactly.
from. So I think empathy plays a big role when you'd like to be present, when you really want to truly, sincerely listen to the other person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you talked about yung empathy, I remember there was this client that's said na sabi niya, I find it, well, complaint to ng partner sa isa na it's hard for me to share kasi I find na yung mga experiences ko are not shared by my partner. Like, they don't have the same experiences as me, so nahirapan ako mag-share. And then that other person said, I don't know how to be, empathic. I don't know how to, do this. So I know people struggle with this too, kasi whether
Yeah.
it's not being
Yeah.
modeled to them, and so on and so forth. And I just kind of talked about this is why we slow things down. This is why we break down the information, break it up, para it gives you that ability to be empathic or empathetic. Kasi yung information is diluted, hindi siya too much for the other person, and it's easier for them to walk into the space kasi broken down siya, distilled siya ng konti, right? They can really listen. And obviously, it also helps kung yung listener is not inundating din. Sorry, not listening, but
Right.
yung speaker, right? Inundating. It's too much, right?
Yeah.
So just a little bit of both, right? A little bit of balance for both, I think. And then and I told them that's what creates that space. I would hate for you to quickly assume na wala kang place of empathy or to assume that your partner cannot do this. I would hate that because then your relationship, that's already like a scar there. So start slow, give each other compassion and patience. Parang allow yourself to make mistakes, ganyan, and it will naturally, kind of follow, right? So, that's what kind of, came up for me.
One of the interesting things that my voice teacher once told me, because I would share, for example, that my anxieties during performances, that sometimes, it just gets too much, your stage fright, your nervousness and all that. So it really affects your singing, not just your movement on stage, but actually your actual voice. It constricts your voice, when you're being nervous, etc. And I remember he said that, Leo, you should realize that it's always possible to breathe. And we've been talking about space, and a lot of times I think people, not just in conflict, but in whatever relationship, people don't realize that there is space. Oh my God, just look at the universe. I mean, the planet Earth is floating in space, there's just so much space. So realize that you actually have access to a lot of space, So he told me that, Leo, when you're singing, realize that it's not the end of the world. That's one. And then two, that you can actually breathe. If you need to breathe, then breathe. Because the more you constrict yourself from breathing because you want the beautiful line, you want to show off that you have, long breath, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
You're going to lose it.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same thing, right? And the whole idea of space, that it's okay to breathe. And I also tell that to the people I interview. A lot of times when they come to the interview nervous, it's so obvious, so I tell them that it's just try to breathe, don't forget to breathe. And sometimes I hear it in their voices that, what, breathing, what kind of new age BS is that? But actually it definitely works. I mean, if you don't breathe, you're going to spew out words without understanding things, and you're going to present ideas in a really convoluted way, and it's not going to help you in your interview. So why not just take a breath and put your thoughts together and all that? It's the same thing with conversations, right? So yeah,
exactly.
How can you listen if there's no space? Yeah.
You need to ground yourself. You need to regulate yourself. You need to parang calm the nervous system, because then when that is calm, yung parang that part of your brain, I forget that part of the brain, the part of the brain that is responsible for executive functioning, is able to access yung mga, exactly like what you said, yung things na you want to share, right? Yung the intention mo, kung ano yung talagang gusto mo i-share, as opposed to like you just acting out just to say something. No?
Yeah.
Right. So that's why it's important to, yun nga, to breathe.
You find clarity when you breathe, right? I mean,
yes. Yeah. Exactly. I know.
Kaya nga, di ba, kung minsan when you're really stressed, you're like, you just really have to sigh, right? I mean, that's also important. Yeah. Yeah.
I know. Yeah. I was gonna say then, one of the parang other things then parang to add to really kind of what we're talking about, right? Like the parang how-tos, or like maybe some strategies or some helpful ways na our listeners and other people can just kind of help with effective listening. Again, our goal is obviously not to be a therapist to everybody, but I think yung pinaka basic lang, kind of like what you said, is like staying in the present, right? So in using that example or yung kwento mo about like just people that having their phones, I think if somebody comes up to you na merong something to share, whether it's like super deep or just like nasa harapan mo, when you just put your phone down and you stay in the present, meaning you take note of yung nonverbals nila, so yung face nila, yung voice nila, yung katawan nila, yung body language. Those are things na parang it really helps you gain. When you focus on those, it gives you a better picture na, they're actually coming from a place na nahirapan sila, or they, and it also helps you just, stay in the present. So yun yung mga things that you can focus on. That way you don't find yourself straying from kung ano yung isip mo, right? So when you really pay attention to that, it helps you stay in the present. And when you focus on yung present, it just allows you to really, gain have better access as to what really is, going on, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't find yourself kind of, getting distracted by other things, by the environment, by the bright lights or whatever it is, no?
Yeah.
Right.
And even with simple sharing, like for example, a person is so happy that they finally got the watch that they wanted. I mean, I've witnessed some conversations where the other person is sharing something positive and the other person just suddenly shuts them down and say that, it's not that expensive, it's actually cheap, or there are better watches, that they really disregard, or they even just ignored the whole person's joy and happiness, so it goes back to what we said also about empathy, that how would you feel if that's done to you? Right? Why can't you just be happy for the other person? Be generous and just share in that joy. You don't have to understand that joy, but just share that, oh my God, he's really happy, I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy you got that. I'm so happy you found that movie funny, because I hear that a lot of times, like they say that, oh, how did you like this? And then I tell them my opinion. I love it. And then they're like, what? You loved it? Why did you love it? I didn't love it. So what kind of a conversation is that? Like, okay, that's your opinion, so don't put that on me. I mean, I enjoyed it.
Just
I've encountered people like that. Or I tell them that I don't like it, and they're like, why come you don't like it? How come you don't like it? Diba? And parang they're like really, they're insisting na parang, I enjoyed it. And parang at the back of my head, I'm like, oh, you enjoyed it? Ako, I didn't enjoy it.
Right. I know it's tough. Oh my gosh, that's tough. No, yun nga, that making that, whether respond sila quickly, whether they need to like defend yung opinion nila. It's tough, right? For sure. I was gonna say when you were talking,
I think the term is mema. Mema sabi lang.
Ayun ba yung yun ba yung slang ngayon, mema?
Yeah, that's what it means. Mema. Para lang may masabi ka. Anyways.
Like, actually, I value yung mga little. Kasi obviously, hindi ko na alam yung mga slang, but I'll gagamitin ko yung sa husband ko. I'm gonna say, you're being a mema right now. I was gonna say, yung sinabi mo na, yung effect, yung listening, no, na sharing their joy. I think sa akin, I think this is, especially for parents, no, na sometimes we're so caught up sa yung mga adulting things that we need to do. Now, when our kid comes to us and shares something, either distracted tayo or like hindi natin na ma-match. But when you sit there in the present and really notice yung, I don't know, like talagang lumaki yung eyes ng anak mo, like the joy in their voice, like the excitedness
Yeah.
that they have. So when you put all of that together, then mas accurately makikita mo na, oh my gosh, like they're really, that they're really experiencing joy. They're really excited about this. So it helps you to match that. No, kasi you see,
Yeah.
all of that, which brings me to the next point ko na when you use those things, when you use those things and you really pay attention to those, it helps you accurately parang reflect what you want to say. Meaning, oh my gosh, like that must have been great. Like, oh, wow, that's so cool na nagawa mo yun. Or like,
Yeah.
because again, you've looked at the entire picture. So yung reflection mo, it's easier to come out. Yung reflection mo kasi mas nakikita mo yung accurate picture. Because I know reflection is hard. It's hard. Obviously, therapists have had years of practice, pero when you actually truly reflect and be that mirror, exactly like you said earlier, like a mirror, it takes time. Pero when you pay attention to these cues, mas madali. Kasi you're looking at the bigger picture, you're listening to the tone, yung body language, all of those things. And also you're taking into consideration how much this person means to you. Right?
Yeah.
So obviously kung anak mo, you want to lean in and consider all of those things. If it's just, some person, you're probably not going to do all of those things, right? So yung ganun lang, then you can accurately reflect kung ano yung experience nila or what they're saying.
Yeah. When you do allow that space for empathy and, being generous with the other person, like you said, the validation, the responses come naturally. And parang you're not quick anymore to give advice or quick to give comments. Parang you're more understanding. And I guess your reaction to the conversation is that you're more calm and you're more engaged, right? You're more in it. You're more in it versus, you're in your head that, okay, this is what I really want to say. But let me just let him finish talking so I could say my piece. I mean, it doesn't really work that way, right? Because you're not really listening because you're already ready to give what you want, what you want to say and all that. And I feel like I think a lot of what people struggle with their parents as well. So it can be a challenge because they're coming from, that's another podcast altogether, but they're coming from their own, traumas and triggers and dramas, etc. So, but yeah, when another, just to add on to what you said about sincere validation, is that when you're truly and sincerely listening, like for example, you said about your kids when they're so happy, it allows you not just a response, but also to share in the joy. And actually, I think the most important for me, for all adults, is wonder. And I feel like we've lost that. We've lost wonderment, finding things wonderful because it's hard living.
We're jaded.
So you've gotten used. Yeah, we're jaded. Yeah, so if you're generous with yourself and with the other person, but I think it eventuates wonder. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Napaka-poignant naman ng moment na yun, na yung point mo.
Sorry,
I just
thought of it now. Parang, wow.
Yeah, especially from like a parent to a child or like even just an adult to a child, no? Yung, or even just like a different perspective. It doesn't have to be a child because we all have different perspectives, no? So when we listen to them and really create that space for them, for example, like ako therapist ako, but if I listen to someone that special, I know that just rock climbs and just talk about like how they do it. When I open that up, like, oh my gosh, this is brand new world na that just opened up before my eyes, na holy crap, ganun pala yun, right? So it's good then it expands yung yung perspective mo. It parang revives or like it creates a sense of wonder. It's just yun yung it's big, it's impactful.
The reaction I get usually with the people I interview, because that's part of my job. I do assessments. I interview applicants to contact centers, and I assess their communication skills. When I recap the things that we've discussed, it always, not always, but a lot of the time they get surprised. I don't know how I mean, I've been to interviews. I'm sure you've been to interviews yourself, but
Mhm.
I guess my style of interviewing is that I really try to frame it in a conversation. And when I do that recap, I mean, I just want to show them that, hey, I actually heard what you were telling me,
Mhm.
you know, and I hear it in their voice that they're like, oh, wow, he was actually listening. And I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, that's one of the reasons
Mhm.
why I pursue and I stay in this job is because I find it interesting talking to people and learning about themselves, and all that.
Mhm.
So it's not just work. I mean, you're also dealing with human beings. So yeah, it lights up other people's faces, right?
Yeah.
When you listen well, when you have
Yeah.
that effort.
Yeah. Kasi sa akin
Yeah.
din, yung personal values ko din is like, I mean, yung personal value ko din, it's like, obviously, like all people deserve that space, right?
Yeah.
Everybody deserves that space, the ability to be seen and heard and all of that. So not just in the work that I do, but just regardless, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and you know, personally, that's just my philosophy. You know, I don't, it's probably different for
Yeah.
others. And so when I kind of like have that in mind,
Yeah.
it helps me to parang redirect myself na, hey, this is what's important for you. And so
Yeah.
parang mas madali nang for me to like, oh, listen and give them that space and so on and so
Mhm.
forth, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. You know what?
right.
Well, just since we're winding things down
Mm-hmm.
already, I mean, you've mentioned this earlier about, that you don't intend to therapize our listeners and all that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and just to piggyback on that, I know that most of the ideas and circumstances we presented on this episode seem idealistic and, a lot of effort and quite challenging. But I mean, especially that we're all distracted, we're pulled in different directions, and God knows that you and I can commiserate to that. You
Right.
know, we're just like you guys. I mean, you guys listening, we're distracted as well. So many
Yeah.
things. Um, we also bring in our own thoughts and our own biases in our own conversations, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess the things that we've learned along the way, why we want to share these is that Steph and I mean, Steph being a therapist and me, my job interviewing people, we just like people to be more aware,
Mm-hmm.
right? To be more aware.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why we're putting in these ideas is that so that it helps with your awareness of your own self and you, how all of us participate in conversations. Because when you're thinking, when you're engaged,
Mm-hmm.
in yourself and with the other person, it's definitely helpful in a more, as Steph put it earlier, in a more meaningful and impactful, not just conversation, but relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it matters having these discussions. It allows a positive space so that everybody can contribute, everybody can learn, and ultimately flourish, right?
Mhm. 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 For sure.
Yeah,
For sure. Yung last
yeah,
thoughts ko lang, Lay, before we close is that
sure.
I think because I think the pandemic really did like a number on us, no? So it really made us
Definitely.
feel, disconnected. I mean, connected in some ways, but also disconnected,
Mm,
in person, no? So kahit na ngayon, like there's still some, obviously, I think this is the year for me personally na parang talagang no apprehensions of like going out and stuff, and that took a while, right? Imagine that 3 years of like being for us like yung family ko talagang enclosed, and then now parang ganon. So as now I'm starting to branch out and even networking with other therapists or meeting clients face to face na lang, for example, no, and being in
yeah,
that physical space with others, talagang nakikita ko really the importance of being there, sitting with someone, walking alongside them, or just sitting
yeah,
alongside them, and listening and talking and engaging. Because now I'm able to not just like network for like, for like business reasons, but really
yeah,
connect with the other person. So now,
yeah,
like with other I network with other therapists, but I got to also connect with them on a deeper level, like got to know them as human beings, connect with them on a parent level, connect with them as a, BIPOC person, which is, again, Black, Indigenous, person of color, people, ganon ba? So then it just allows us to connect. So even if we don't have an intimate relationship with one another, meron na kaming, connection, right? We have something
Yeah.
shared.
Yeah.
And I think yun yung things na parang was sort of like, not really, that was definitely missing nung we were just, parang enclosed in our own little bubble sa pandemic. So ngayon, it's so important, even more so important ngayon na to allow this to happen, listening, engaging, having conversations, kasi this is what's going to help, again, keep us going, validate our existence, connect,
Yeah.
feel good about ourselves, feel good about the world, and sharing all of
Yeah.
that with everybody. So, yun lang.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right. So again, it was wonderful to be back in this space and have
Yes.
this conversation again. It's been a while. So it was good to be able to share some thoughts with our listeners. And so we hope that you were able to take away some thoughts naman from what we shared. And as always, we're here if you have any either suggestions or comments or just any reflections about our episode. And so, Lay, any other parting words?
Yeah, let's continue talking, let's continue connecting, and let's continue understanding each other. Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll see you guys again on our next episode. Yeah, and we can't wait for the next one. And yeah, thanks again for being here with us.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Bye bye.